Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about the economy in the 1920s, a period of growth known as the Roaring Twenties, and also the beginning of the Great Depression that begins in the year 1929. And here we have a blank slide. I don't know why this is in the slideshow. And here are your video goals. So you'll notice there are a lot of terms to define. Your video quiz on Monday is definitely going to focus on those terms, so make sure you know what those are. I'd highly recommend that you write a definition or something like that. So the big shift that happens in the 1920s as far as economics goes is a return to laissez-faire economics, also known as free market economics. Basically what this means is it's a type of economic policy where the government doesn't interfere with business. So it's kind of a return to what was going on during the Gilded Age. During the Progressive Era, presidents spent a lot of time increasing the power of government and using the power of government to limit what businesses could do. During the 1920s, the presidents and Congress push back against that and give more freedom to big businesses because they think this will be good for the economy. Once again, it's called laissez-faire economics. It's a French term that means let it be or let it do. So basically leave the economy alone, let business do its thing. So anyway, in this return to laissez-faire economics, the government under President Warren G. Harding in the first part of the 1920s repeals child labor laws, weakens labor unions, weakly enforces antitrust laws allowing companies to get bigger and bigger, and raises the tariff that Woodrow Wilson had lowered. Raising the tariff especially is going to turn out to be a bad idea for a number of reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit. Future presidents, all of them Republicans, by the way, Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover follow Warren G. Harding in this policy of laissez-faire economics. And for a while, it seems to be working very well. That's Calvin Coolidge there. He was president for most of the 1920s, known as Silent Cal. He really didn't talk very much. He didn't give very many speeches, and he was overall an incredibly lazy president. He would take naps most days and spend a lot of time hanging out on farms in or ranches and stuff in the Midwest instead of doing his job as president. He basically believed that government's job was to do very little, which was great for him because he didn't feel like doing very much. And then there's Herbert Hoover, who you can see there. He was a more active president, but as soon as he took over in 1929, the economy collapsed, and so he didn't really have much of a chance to shine. We'll look more at his response to the Great Depression in the weeks to come. Sometimes the time period in the Roaring Twenties is called the Golden Twenties, also known as the Roaring Twenties, and the reason for this is largely because of rapid economic growth, largely resulting from increased production during World War I. During World War I, the United States made all sorts of stuff, all sorts of equipment and gear to ship over to Europe for the war. Now that the war was over, they could turn all of that productive capacity back into the United States, and they started producing all sorts of awesome stuff. This meant that there were more products available for average Americans than ever before, including radios, which were a big deal back then. The ability to pump music into your house was amazing seeming at that time. There's a picture there of a radio that actually looks like a big piece of furniture. Also, cars were becoming more and more common during this time period, and home appliances like irons and washing machines and vacuum cleaners were becoming more common during this time period as well. This was made easier for average Americans to consume these things with a thing called an installment plan. People still use installment plans all the time, especially on like cars and stuff like that. So basically an installment plan was you could get something right away, like you could get an expensive radio, and you could pay for it in little chunks. So for example, that radio there, it cost $88, but you only had to pay $2.50 a week. So you could get the radio now and pay for it a little bit over time. And this made it way easier for normal Americans to afford fancy new stuff. Also, average people started buying into the stock market. The stock market used to kind of just be a thing for rich bankers and businessmen, but it was a way in which anybody could buy parts of American companies. So if you had some extra money, rather than putting it in a bank, you could put it in the stock market. And you could buy a small portion of a company. So let's say like Ford Motors. You could buy a part of Ford Motors. And whenever Ford Motors made money, and the value of their stock would go up, and your wealth would increase along with that stock. Now, not everybody had enough money to get into the stock market, so what people started doing was this thing called buying on margin. Buying on margin is when you would borrow money from the bank. That is, you'd get a loan from the bank, and then you would invest that borrowed money into the stock market. That way, even people who didn't have very much money could try to get rich by investing in companies. This turned out to be a very bad idea. So basically what you see during this time period is a cycle of increasing production and increasing debt. Americans are buying more and more, and they're buying more of it with borrowed money from banks. And while this is good in the short term, it ends up having some negative effects that manifest during the Great Depression. Another big problem that's going on during this time period is dealing with foreign debt. Basically, after World War I, France and Britain owed billions of dollars to the United States, but can't pay it back. They basically don't have the money. Their industry has been damaged by the war. Germany is not paying back its war damages to Britain and France. And the United States' high tariff that was set during the Harding administration made it very difficult for Britain and France to trade their way back into prosperity by selling stuff to the United States. So there was really no way for Britain and France to pay back the US loans. The United States came up with a solution called the Dawes Plan, which is very important. How it worked is the United States would loan money to Germany, and Germany would use that money to pay back Britain and France. Then Britain and France would give that money to the United States in order to repay their loans. So basically what the United States was doing was transferring the debt from Britain and France to Germany, who would have to pay the United States back later. But anyway, this worked in restoring sort of a normal relationship between the major economies of the world. But you'll notice that the entire system rests upon U.S. loans, that is, loans from U.S. banks. And if that stops, then the whole system will break down and the world economy will collapse. And this is exactly what happens. Basically, even though the economy seems good in the 1920s, it sets us up for a really bad situation. And that is the stock market crash of 1929, sometimes known as Black Tuesday, because it was a very dark period in U.S. economics. So in 1929, the entire world economy rested on the United States. But the United States had a lot of debt. Individuals owed the bank a lot of money, and a lot of the bank's money was invested in the stock market. Because everybody was buying into the stock market, what you got was something called a stock market bubble, in which people kept buying and buying and buying into the stock market, no matter how expensive the stock market got. Basically, people thought that the price of stocks was going to go up forever. But the only thing that kept stock prices going up was the belief that they would continue to go up. People would buy stock no matter how expensive, believing that it would become even more expensive in the future. But, of course, that didn't make any sense. Eventually, it would go back down to a normal price. And that happened very suddenly on a Tuesday called Black Tuesday, where because of some little shifts in some stuff happening in a bank in Britain that we don't need to worry about, some people started to sell their stocks. And as this happened, the share price of stocks dropped a little bit. And when that happened, other people started to panic and thought that they were going to drop a lot, so everybody started to sell. This kicked off a chain reaction in which everybody was trying to sell their stock as fast as possible. And what this meant is that stock prices plummeted and lost a third of their value in a single day. That is, billions of dollars of money tied up in contracts just disappeared, and all of a sudden, people were totally broke. Banks, because of this, and because they had just lost a lot of money that they had lended to people, stopped giving out new loans. Because the banks won't give out new loans, the entire economy grinds to a halt. Average people can't afford to buy stuff anymore. Big businesses can't get loans to start to produce new things. And economies around the world can no longer rely on U.S. credit to fund their economies. And this leads to the greatest economic disaster in modern history, called the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a worldwide depression, started by the United States, but that affected everybody. Basically, the U.S. loans to Europe stop, and this causes the European economy to collapse as well. In the United States, you see a cycle of poverty in which United States consumers stop buying new things. Because they stop buying new things, U.S. companies are not selling as much, and because they're not selling as much, they are losing money and they are forced to lay off workers. And this leads to a feedback loop, because now fewer people have jobs, which means they have less money. And because they have less money, they're buying fewer things, which forces companies to fire even more workers. So you get into this awful downward spiral in which unemployment leads to more people becoming unemployed. And Hoover and the other laissez-faire economists who work for him and work for the United States government don't know what to do. Basically, they think that the government is just supposed to sit back and watch it happen. They do try a couple little things here and there. Herbert Hoover builds the Hoover Dam, for example, and employs thousands of people in building that. But for the most part, they just sit back and watch the economy collapse. This ends with millions of people out of work and a realization that new solutions are needed. This is going to lead in the future to the New Deal, in which FDR is going to totally revolutionize the United States economy. But for the next few years, Americans are going to be stuck in a bad economy with no way out. Millions of people unemployed with no hope of finding any sort of decent job. Here are the video goals. Once again, make sure you're on top of those vocab terms, and I will see you guys tomorrow.